Well, good evening. I am so thrilled to have all of you here on this first, can we say wintry? Like that's really weird. It's not wintry, right? It's not winter yet. So thanks for braving the weather and for being out with us tonight. This is a great time to silence your phones if you haven't done that already. So go ahead and do that. And while you're doing that, I will say I am Gretchen Strohmeyer. I'm the Director of Spiritual Formation here at Holy Spirit Church. And welcome to this community conversation. Thank you to MCAT for being here tonight and for rebroadcasting, and for Partners for Reintegration for being here and collaborating with us. And it's exciting to have a cross-section of folks from churches, nonprofit organizations, elected officials, and other community leaders to be here for this important topic tonight. So, gosh, coming up on 3 years ago, the National Episcopal Church challenged all Episcopal churches across the country to study this issue of mass incarceration, and specifically to read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And so a group of us, recently finished a 6-week book study doing just that. And so tonight we're here to check out the assumptions of that book. How do those assumptions fit with the local dynamics, the things we know locally here in Missoula, Montana? How does it resonate? How does it not resonate? And then a friend of ours, Karen Orzik, she challenged us to throw into that pot the concept of restorative justice. What does that look like? What would that look like? How could we potentially move forward with restorative justice in Missoula, Montana? Now, on the first night of that book study, as we went around the table, somebody said, I wonder if the United States has a punishment problem. And I started thinking about that and have been thinking about that for several weeks now. And what would it be like if restoration was part of this criminal justice system? If healing, could we say healing, could perhaps be part of that package? And that's what we're really after tonight, is to check those things out. So our panelists. So we have Judge Landy Holloway, Justice of the Peace. And we have Lauren Pope, who's a returning citizen and also a peer support recovery coach. And John Smith, who's a defense attorney. And Norm Lavery, who is an author and a mediator. And Todd McLean, who works, let's make sure I get it right here, Missoula Correctional Services. He's the Community Services Coordinator. And on the end, Ann Miller, who's the manager for the Tribal Defender's Office for the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. So thank you all for being here. So just a little bit of background about the book, and then we'll jump in with Landy. So as we've been reading Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she claims that the punitive nature of mandatory sentences, particularly related to drug crimes, has had a huge negative impact on the criminal justice system, and that it ultimately has been used as a tool to relegate African Americans to an undercaste. She states that once convicted, a person is a felon for life, pushing him or her to the margins of society. So Landy, if you could respond about the punitive nature of mandatory sentences, and that looks a little bit different here in Missoula with what you're doing, I understand that. What sort of changes you've witnessed, what sort of impacts you see, and also this piece about once you're a felon for life and perhaps part of an undercast system.
Okay. Do that in 30 seconds. There. Can you hear me? So a little bit, just so you know where I'm coming from when I'm talking, I was a probation and parole officer in the felony system for 21 years and then became a judge just a little over it was about a year and a half ago. So much of what I may speak on will pull on some of my past experiences. when we talk about, the question was punitive nature of mandatory sentences, how has it changed the criminal justice system? You know, I think that and I believe probably John will be able to speak a little bit more to this. The mandatory sentences you hear about a lot are oftentimes in the federal system. There are some mandatory sentences with our state system, but it's a little bit more, I would say, flexible. I've seen some things happen just recently in the legislative session this time around with regards to misdemeanors and changing some of those mandatory sentences that came with misdemeanors, such as your misdemeanor theft, first, second, and third convictions. And prior to this last legislative session, you had 30 days that a person was required to serve on a third theft. And so understanding that was adding to some of our incarceration. The legislature had made some of those changes, and now I believe it comes with 10 days. I may be incorrect on that, but there's no longer the mandatory of 30 days. Some things that I've seen in the system have been a little bit interesting with regards to, I was actually around 20 years ago when the Sentencing Commission changed back in 1995. It was another part of the legislative session. And at that time, you had the state system, the prisons were becoming very overcrowded. And one of the things that came about was what was called the Department of Corrections commitment. And that enabled the prison systems to release, to actually provide another sentencing alternative to reduce some of the incarceration impacts. And that at that time was really effective. But I think what happened is that we continued, as we all know, and the reason why we're here tonight is the incarceration continued. And the state of Montana is the only state in the nation who has what's called a Department of Corrections commitment. In addition to that, you also saw a philosophy with corrections about trying to focus on community supervision and having 80% of their people who were under supervision to be in the community versus they were locked up. And that was a philosophy that changed the way that the Department of Corrections was functioning, in that it provided some other sentencing alternatives. There's quite a few of community correction alternatives that are in the state as well. And so the other question that Gretchen had asked is, once convicted, is a person a felon for life and create a caste system? And for those of you who read the book, you understand that a lot of the caste system, you know, we do it in comparison to the to the African American population. We don't have quite the same issues here in Montana, although we do have some of the Native Americans. However, that caste system, one of the, I think it does create a stigma that comes. Part of my role as a parole officer was working on a reentry caseload and dealing with a lot of high-risk people that were coming out of the prison. And so there is a stigma there. Some of that stigma started before somebody ever even entered the criminal justice system. And so you had people who maybe were broken before they got into the system, had influences in their families and so forth, and part of that their life choices ended up maybe in the prison system and coming out, depending on how maybe institutionalized a person was, or maybe some of the other opportunities that were given to them or not given to that individual. Until a person changes their core values and beliefs, then that stigma is going to be there. And I can tell you that dealing with people maybe who had spent 20 years in prison coming out and trying to convince somebody that they are a good candidate for employment or a place to live, there was definitely a stigma there, and if we want to say that's the same as a caste system, absolutely. But I think part of that caste system is not so much as, keeping in mind, it's not so much as the individual as it is the community and how we respond to that. So, Gretchen, I think I'll stop with that.
Anne, could you respond and give us a sense of how things are in the Native American community? In the book, she talks a lot about African Americans and the high rate of incarceration. And tell us a little bit about that from your perspective, please.
First of all, I don't think I can speak to the entire Native American community in Montana. I can speak to what I know about some research I've done for purposes of our program and also just what I've experienced on the Flathead Reservation. Can you hear me? Is this even? Okay. Overall, in Montana, the population of Native Americans is about 7%, and 20% of men in prison in Montana are Native, and 34% of women in prison are Native. So we know there's an overrepresentation of Native people in our prison system. In Missoula County, the last time I saw these figures, Missoula County has about 3% Native people. 14% of the detention population in Missoula is Native. So we know there's an overrepresentation. In terms of the caste system, I guess what we call it for Native Americans is assimilation. That's what happened to Native people by the dominant culture in an attempt to have them give up their culture and become assimilated to the white culture after they were conquered. So I see often the criminal justice system as an attempt to continue to assimilate the Native culture. One of the things I was supposed to address was whether there is an overrepresentation due to crimes related to drugs and alcohol. What I see, generally speaking, is over-incarceration due to criminalization. I think we can't talk about mass incarceration without talking about criminalization of mental illness and addiction. And by the way, to me, those two things are the same. The criminal justice system doesn't see that. They see that as go get yourself fixed with your mental illness, and then go get yourself fixed with addiction. Go get yourself treated and then come back to the community fixed so that we can tolerate you, basically. I know that I sound cynical, but I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen the toll that it's taken on people. And in the community where I work, the toll is taken not just on the individual people that I represent, but it's taken on families. And it's a tribal community that I work in, and in a court system that is based on an Anglo model of individual rights, but we have a tribal community. So when we speak about restorative justice in that context, that is what our office, the Tribal Defender's Office, is trying to do, is get back in many of those cultural values and the traditional justice values rather than incarcerate. And what I see often with incarceration is that it's becoming a way to vindicate the court and vindicate the prosecution for not following the rules that they've set once you're in the criminal justice system. And if you can't follow those rules, then often it's so difficult to get out of that cycle. We were just talking before the meeting about, for instance, if you have a suspended driver's license because you owe a huge fine that you can't pay, but you got to keep driving because you live on the Flathead Reservation, that's the only way you can get from one place to another, then you get another driving while suspended ticket. And then you get suspended again, and you keep going and going. And you live from place to place because you're basically homeless, and you do what we call sofa surfing. And so if you probably never got the letter from the Department of Motor Vehicles that said that you are suspended and why. So it's just one of the examples of those collateral consequences that come with charges and convictions, but just charges that just keep you in the system and keep you down in that sense.
Norm, could you do a little definition for us about restorative justice? Can you fill that out for us? How does it work? If we're talking about restorative justice, does that mean that you never do any hard time? Give us a picture of that.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm delighted to be here tonight. And I'm going to try to give a definition of restorative justice. You have a handout that very succinctly talks about the difference between retributive justice and restorative justice. In retributive justice, which we're all familiar with, 3 questions are: what crime was committed, who did it, and what penalty do they deserve? In restorative justice, the questions are: who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose responsibility is it to fulfill those needs? So quite different. And the handout, which I hope you take a chance to read, if you need more, just let me know. The handout is from the book that I published last year called The Power of Circles, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. What I'd like to do with my time tonight is tell you a little bit about my journey that has led to restorative justice being a very important part of my life. Then I'd like to talk about the circle process, which you might have heard about in indigenous cultures, and give a few tips on how the circle process can be used in each of our individual lives to bring restorative justice alive in each of our daily lives. My journey began in 1999 in Phoenix when I went to a conference called the National Conference on Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution. A really funky conference. The organization is still existing. You walk into the convention hall and there's a large area with a bunch of easel pads, and anybody who wanted to give a session just wrote it up on the board and said, room 132, we'll talk about marital disputes, or we'll talk about finances, whatever it might be. And I saw one that said circle sentencing. So I said, that really sounds interesting. So I went to that one, and they showed a video called Circle Sentencing, a Yukon Justice Experiment. Some of you might have seen that. And the lead actor is Judge Barry Stewart, who for many years was a provincial judge up in Whitehorse. And I thought so highly of what I had heard that I decided that I would come back to Missoula and try to bring the circle process not only to Missoula but to the state of Montana. And it's interesting that I have kept in touch with Judge Barry Stewart. I took the opportunity to visit him at his home deep in the woods north of Squamish, British Columbia 2 years ago. And we spent about 4 hours together, a glass of wine and lunch, and learned that he, as a seminal person in the restorative justice field worldwide, had started his career in restorative justice in Papua New Guinea when he was dealing with tribal land rights. Anyway, Judge Stewart also is one of the people who has acknowledged my book, The Power of Circles, and you will see that in a flyer that I will hand out. I watched the video about the 13th. I didn't read the book. I watched the video, and I also watched the interview that Oprah had with Ava, if that sounds familiar. And this is a quote by Ava. What do you want to do now? Maybe some of you remember that. And I asked myself that question too, which led to deciding to bring the circle process into Missoula and into Montana, which led to the formation of the nonprofit community circles in 2002. And since that time, we've helped many, many tens of individuals, mostly teenagers, get back on a good life track. They're not bad kids, but they've done stupid things, and hence they've gotten into the formal legal system. We have given them a place that's safe and confidential to tell their story, and we're firm believers that by so doing, people have got the wherewithal to solve most of their problems. We just give them a forum to tell their stories, be listened to, and if we guide at all, it's from our own experience banks, so that we can help them from our experiences as old people. It's been very successful, and Karen's not here tonight. Karen As I say, he gave us a lot of referrals, and she can attest to the power of some of the transformations we've made in these people's lives. And there are lots of anecdotal stories in The Power of Circles that I hope you'll sometime have a chance to read. The gift that we give people in the circle process is hope. And a lot of people don't have hope, but when we gave these kids a sense of hope that we believe in you, that you do have the wherewithal to become productive adults, then remarkable things happen. This is the greatest gift that we have given to these people. And I've got flyers about the Community Circles program here for later on. And I also have a one-page article written by somebody in the Department of Corrections. It was in their newsletter. And she talks about community circles and the training program that we instituted. We've trained over 150 people in the state of Montana to be circle keepers. So other than dealing directly with kids, we have also trained a number of people to take this process into their own communities, and we're continuing to do that work. Well, I had a desire to spread the circle process a little bit more widely than locally. That's led to my spending a year writing The Power of Circles. And if you've ever published something, you know what a hard job it is with reviews and copy editing and all the steps that you have to go through to do that. But the book has been very well received, both in terms of its message and its presentation. So when you get the flyer, I hope you'll consider it as something that you might want to read. Now to the circle process and how we can use it in our own lives. You've all watched television news, right? And whether it's CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or NPR, there's usually a moderator and a couple of panelists. And the moderator will ask a question, and one of the panelists will start responding, and as soon as the respondent starts speaking, the moderator starts talking again and speaks over the person who's responding to the point where it's a cacophony of two voices going back and forth and talking over each other. Well, I'm a firm believer that if I'm talking, I'm giving up the opportunity to learn. And these people who are talking over each other are not learning a thing. They're just doing something from the sense of ego satisfaction. So in the circle process, that doesn't happen. A little bit about the circle process. People do indeed sit in a circle, with or without a table, and it doesn't matter whether the table is round or square or rectangular. And a talking piece is used to manage the conversation, and only the person who's holding the talking piece has a chance to speak, and everybody else listens. So one of the things that is commonly used in indigenous cultures is abredo sweetgrass, and I'm very fortunate to be able to grow this here in Missoula in my garden. Another thing that's commonly used is a little stone that I carry in my pocket at all times with peace engraved on it. And this is a very special talking piece. It's a beaded stick that one of our Community Circles clients gave to the Community Circles program in thanks for what we had done to help him get his life back on track. So it doesn't matter what the talking piece is, but if somebody across the circle from me is speaking, I can listen mindfully from my heart to the words spoken and to the emotions expressed, the kinesics, the body language, because I know when the talking piece comes around to me, everybody will do the same and listen to me as I tell my story. So this is so different from what we see coming out of Washington and the media, and I think you can see the difference. We also live in a culture that is very judgmental, and I'm not talking about dialect where people use the Socratic method to counter each other's arguments. I'm talking about vitriol. I'm talking about things you see in the television and hear on the radio every day where people are just downright nasty to other people. In the circle process, there is no judgment. All you can do is build on the positive statements that are made by other people in the circle, trying to reach positive conclusions, whether it's solving a problem or whether it's just giving strength to the person who might be having a bad day. Third, we're in a world of I thingies, okay? You go to the park and you sit and you watch people on a park bench, and every one of them has got their nose in this little eye thingy. I'm sorry, eye thingy. These things here, okay? It's my daughter's term. They're not communicating with other human beings. In the circle process, we look each other in the eye. We're able to see their feelings and understand when their tears come, when their hands start to tremble. This is something you cannot do when you're just communicating through an eye thingy, an iPad or an iPhone. Again, apologize for my use of terms. The circle process is a very good place for telling stories, and in so doing, we give energy to other people. You've had the experience of talking with another individual, and they sit and they're raptly interested in what you're saying. Their eyes are cast on your eyes. They might be leaning forward a little bit, and you realize what a gift it is that that person is giving to you, because they are showing that they care about you. This is something that's very important in the circle process. It's a time for caring, solving problems, building or rebuilding relationships. So the circle process has got a lot of very valuable things that that can be brought to bear on relationships, whether it's 2 people in a circle or 20 people in a circle. And I've been in a circle with 22 people, and it works just fine. So what can we do as individuals and organizations? Whether you're in a small group or a larger group of 20, listen mindfully without interruption. Do not be judgmental. Build only on the positive ideas of others. Invite others to tell their stories. This is a gift you can give to them. Ask questions rather than make statements. This is a good key toward getting people to open up and talk to you and tell their stories. If there's one thing I'd like you to take away from my words tonight, it's to realize that every relationship changes with every interaction you have with another human being. And if during that interaction, you take the opportunity to give energy to the other person rather than take energy away, then you are enacting the principles of restorative justice every single day. Giving energy rather than taking energy away is so key. We don't do it very well, but if you just keep that in mind and enact that in your own lives, as I try to do in mine, can be a very powerful statement to everybody around you. And it's amazing how this will come back to you. Okay. Gretchen?
So we get a sense, Norm, I think you help us understand the importance of really connecting with other human beings and how restorative and healing that can be when people have the opportunity to be in those sort of healing environments. But as I talked to folks for this panel, I had a sense that restorative justice was a very broad term as well. And when I talked to Commissioner Colaroli, she was talking about jail diversion. And it's like, okay, jail diversion, that can be restorative justice too. So I'm wondering if there are other folks on the panel that want to throw their 2 cents in about restorative justice from your angle. Is there a little bit you would say? Anybody else want to respond to that? You don't have to. You don't have to go down the line, but if a couple people want to respond to that, that'd be great.
I could.
Yep.
Okay, so I gotta turn it on. Yeah. There we go. I guess this will be the talking stick. Thank you for that. That was very informative. I'm a criminal defense lawyer for 30 years, and so I look at people across my desk or side by side at my conference table who are in a lot of pain and a lot of, they're just in a very, very bad, dark place usually. And I have many times been struck by how retributive, and I liked it that you said that, the difference between retributive justice and restorative justice, but just how retributive our system is, because I sit there with these people, and it's not just once or twice, it's 10 and 15 and 20 times, and I get to know them, and I get to know and hear their story. And I hear it in a way that it's very difficult for it to be heard in the courtroom or in the within the criminal justice system. So I get to know my clients as human beings and to realize that the source of their pain. And I take it upon myself just because I'm a member of this community too, and I know that crime, when it's committed, tears the social fabric. And so I want to help my clients figure out how they came to be in my office in the first place. And I tell them that. I say, let's try to figure this out together. And you know what? It tends to work. Over the years, I think I've developed a reputation with judges and probation officers, actually, that I do this kind of work with my clients in order to help them out of the rut they're in, help them back onto the path on which they can restore themselves and restore their place in our community and in their family and whatever. Too oftentimes I see, and it's saddening to me, and I've got questions, we can go down this slowly, I'll give this up and come back, but is that the retributive side of our nature, I guess, because our nature is reflected in our laws, we can't deny that. We elect legislators, we call them, write them letters. The criminal justice system tends to oftentimes try to fix a watch with a sledgehammer, I always say. It just is so harsh at times. And I worked in the federal system, I work in the federal system now, but I worked in the federal system from the very inception of the United States sentencing guidelines that required mandatory sentences, not mandatory minimum sentences, mandatory sentences. Sentences that were driven by, and if you read this book, Jim Crow, you were reading about drugs and drug crimes. Well, the sentencing guidelines were tied to, in drug cases, the quantity of the drug, okay? The quantity of the drug within the conspiracy. So if you have, 4 or 5 people and they have various jobs within this illegal formation, that's what constitutes a conspiracy, to distribute drugs, all of the drugs in the conspiracy, whether the first guy or gal in the chain is aware of how many drugs there are involved by the time the 5th person's involved, they're all responsible for the total quantity of the drugs. And then their offense level under the United States sentencing guidelines was driven by that quantity. And then the judges, so that would give you an offense level, and then they just basically was a mathematical matrix that the judge would look at, and depending on their criminal history category, it assigned the number of months that person would have to do in prison. And I can tell you that I saw more 20 to 25-year-old Montana kids go to federal prison for in excess of 5 years, 60 months, it's always months in the federal system, during that time that I can count. And I used to say, if we want to deter kids from distributing drugs in our small town, as we like to call Montana, and the federal government, this is what this is supposed to be all about, then why don't we have billboards all up and down I-90 that tell these kids, do you realize you're going to go to prison and it's going to be mandated by the law and the judge isn't even going to be able to have anything to say about it? And you're going to go to prison for 5 years or more. So I thought it was a little bit hypocritical, the way that was all set up. And again, fixing a watch with a sledgehammer. These kids don't come out of prison. I thought to myself, when I was 20, I took my time going through undergrad, 25 years old, and I went to law school. I got out with a law degree. And here I am paying taxes, making a living, raising my family. And these kids are in federal prison during that same time in their lives, and they're coming out with an F on their forehead and no degree. And how could they be better off? And how could our community be better off having them come back in that way, rather than if we had a system that was more restorative and using all of these principles to guide what we do when someone commits a crime.
Who else wants to jump in and say something about what restorative justice looks like from your angle? Randy?
Let me introduce myself. I'm Todd with Community Service at Missoula Corrections, and I'm retired federal probation officer after 22 years. I work with John on a lot of those mandatory cases with Judge Holloway and state probation.
John, could you hold it really close to your mouth?
Okay, and so I had cases with John, and I reiterate a lot of things that he said, that seeing young kids go away for 5-10 years, and it wasn't just 5 or 10 years. On an individual's first conviction, the minimum would be 5 years, second conviction 10, and on up incrementally. And the only way these kids could get out of prison early, and John, chime in whenever you need to, but was what was called a federal rule 35, which means they had to give substantial assistance to the federal government. And that is the only way that these kids the judge could come down off those mandatory sentences. And later on, John mentioned the statutory guidelines. Those were just guides for the judges. And I worked with those guidelines. But if it was a drug conviction, there was no way off of that unless they cut a plea deal with the government and that they were going to give information. Now you tell me how much a kid in Montana at 24, 3, 5, whatever, knows enough to help the judge come off those mandatory minimums, especially if he's just like a mule bringing drugs into Montana. He's lowest on the totem pole. He will not be able to help himself out. He's going to do his 5 years. As far as restorative justice, I know that Judge Holloway worked with it in different forms as a probation officer. Certainly I did, tapping into the different resources in the community. And maybe I'm a little old school too, but after 30 years of a probation officer, like I said, 22 in the federal government, the individual at these different resources, if you're trying to help these young men and women come out of prison, has to tap in to whatever they're buying, or make them tap into the program, or you are not going to have success. And it's up to us as a Missoula community to have those programs available for the probation officer, for the pretrial officers, so that it's just not, like John says, sitting down 10 or 20 times with these individuals, really getting to know them. So I guess that's my 2 cents, Gretchen.
So I'm probably going to echo some of the same things, and I think that I've worked with Norm for a long time as well, and I watched all of his videos, and I love his approach to that restorative justice with the circle approach. I think one of the other things is that restorative justice, when you're working with an individual, is meeting that person where they are and understanding where they are in that program, because a lot of times we can place values or expectations on somebody, but they may not even know how to get there. And understanding, an individual I worked with one time had been in prison for 25 years. When he came out, he'd never seen a remote control or an automatic door, or understood a microwave. How and where do you even start with that person? Because none of us would ever know what that fear is if you're walking through an automatic door at a grocery store and you jump back. So meeting that person where they are and empowering them to be that productive, tax-paying citizen that we expect. I think that we can't always put everybody into the same group or category, again, to the expectations. And so part of the restorative justice is also restoring the family component and breaking that cycle, intervening in the cycle, because what we know is that generational influence and behaviors there. And so we have to really kind of, the restorative part is to change that thought process and to move along. Restorative justice with regards to my involvement with Partners for Reintegration is a lot of advocating and educating the community, taking away the fear. And I think you'll talk, you know, in the book, The New Jim Crow talked about the fear. In the documentary, it was that there is a fear that's created there. And so people turn their back and walk away. And what does that say about us as a society? I mean, we really knew, and when the war of drugs came in, and with the reduction of mental health services, and I know that Ann had commented on this, it is a mental health and chemical dependency issue that is coupled with many of the things that we deal with in the criminal justice system. And so part of that restorative justice is to have those tools there for the probation officers or for the court systems, and having that available. So I think that we can, I'll stop there. Anybody else?
Mine is not going to be done when I talk.
Okay. John, do you want to go ahead and address some of your other questions? Some of the questions we gave to John. Does the fear related to length of sentences cause defendants to plead guilty? Has the rate of guilty pleas increased over the last 30 years? What sort of changes in the system have you witnessed in your career in regards to drug-related crime? Yeah.
Okay. Of course, fear of lengthy incarceration causes people to plead guilty. I want to say something about what I think lengthy sentences are out there for, because, and I mentioned the word deterrent, I think, a minute ago, to deter crime. And I don't believe in that, because I think people who commit crimes are committing them, like I said, from painful, dysfunctional places. And I don't think that they are as rational to stop and think, if I do this, I could go to prison for 25 years or whatever. They just do it, and you know, they're out of their minds half the time, out of their right minds all the time when they're committing crimes, and for lots and lots and lots of reasons. Changes I've seen, one good change I've seen is, I was just talking about the mandatory sentencing guidelines. The U.S. Supreme Court stepped in finally, oh gosh, I don't know, I can't keep track of the years anymore, but 8 years ago maybe, 6, 7, 8 years ago, in a case called Booker, and said that the guidelines would no longer be mandatory, that they would be discretionary and would be just a guide to the judge. So the judge did not have to sentence within that guideline range mandatorily. That has been a real positive thing, because, for instance, Judge Christensen, downtown Missoula, one of our newer judges, federal judges, when the federal authorities raided all the medical marijuana places in Montana, most of those cases ended up in front of Judge Christensen. And Judge Christensen, I could tell by his sentences, because, you know, there was lots and lots and lots of drugs, so the quantity, and so the sentencing guidelines was, you know, 10 years plus for a lot of those cases and the people involved. And he made a decision, I'm not going to send people to prison for marijuana, especially people who were growing what they thought was medicine or felt was medicine, even though it is against the federal law. And I'm, you know, bound by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, but I don't have to send them to prison. They're already going to be convicted federal felons for this, which is a lot more punishment than people realize in terms of your civil rights, because they lose them all pretty much, including the right to vote, which, you want to talk about disenfranchisement, you take away the right to vote for every felon, and the rate at which we create, our laws create, and the people violate those laws become felons. Your voting public starts to dwindle. What was the last one?
Well, you might have.
I think I may have already answered it about restorative justice. I just can't. I do want to tell one anecdote, and that is, I did a case because it was so powerful, and it was right along these lines. I did the first vehicular homicide case in the state of Montana after a new law was enacted, And it was in response to people dying dying in accidents involving drunk drivers, a very serious situation in our society and in Montana. And so the legislature passed a law that said if you're driving under the influence, which means anything over a .08 blood alcohol content, and you get in an accident, a traffic accident that happened, and someone's killed, then you have committed the offense of vehicular homicide, and that's punishable by 30 years in prison. Well, I had a kid who was drunk, and so were his two best friends, and they hit a tree, and the two best friends were killed. His two best friends. And so I was faced with this young man just in absolute pieces in my office, understanding that his two best friends had just died and he was behind the wheel when it happened. Now, this kid is not a murderer. I mean, he didn't set out to kill anybody, and these were his two best friends. But the story I want to tell about that case is that he really wanted to talk with his best friend Seth's mother. And we arranged for that to happen at the county attorney's office. Karen Townsend, who's now a district court judge, was the prosecutor in the case. And I remember just dreading this meeting. I didn't know how I was going to live through it. I had nightmares. I don't think I hardly slept the night before, but I went because I was with my client, and Karen was there, the crime victim advocate. The mother came in, and my client and she were at the other end of the table, and they talked and hugged and cried, and I cried, Karen cried, we all cried for quite a while. But I remember how good I felt coming out of that meeting, surprised. It was cathartic. It was restorative. It really was. And that situation, we were in front of a judge. It was the very first case in Montana under this new law. Following that meeting, the dead boy's mother had told my client that she forgave him, which of course, just broke his heart even more, but she gave the prosecution and the judge permission to not send my client to prison, knowing that it was not going to do any good to send him to prison and wasn't going to bring her son back. There wasn't any big amount of rehabilitation to be done in my client in the sense of his criminal ways. I mean, he had to stop drinking and that sort of thing, but what happened was he went around, he didn't go to prison, the judge honored that, he didn't go to prison, and he went around to high schools and college classes, and he talked to them, and he told them what had happened to him, and he shared his story with, I can't even, so if just compare that to him sitting in a prison cell. The good, which does better for our society? The former or the latter? That's always stuck with me. And I'll just finish that story with, he named his firstborn child after his best friend.
Great example of a circle, isn't that right, Nora?
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to jump in there real quick, and then we're going to skip over to Lauren. Do you want to jump in real quick, Nora?
If I may, just for a minute. John, that scenario could not be replicated anywhere else. And the person you're talking about is the person who made this. And I accompanied him to Stevensville or Corvallis because he didn't drive, and accompanied him when he gave one of those talks to the high school. I just want to let you know, connection. Yeah.
Yep.
Good example. So Lauren, why don't we get your voice in this? Lauren joins us as a returning citizen, and just if you can give us your experience with the criminal justice system, and also just talk to us a little bit about the label of felon and how that impacts life.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah? I get nervous when I talk, so please bear with me. First of all, I wanted to say I have been a returning citizen twice. So my experience with the criminal justice system, when I started, I moved to Missoula, divorced, a single mom, going to the university, a full-time job. It was all a lot for me to handle. I found relief in drugs. I started when I was 32. But the devastation that I caused, I was a mom, it still affects everybody involved today. So when I became a felon and returned to try and become a productive member of society, I was met with a lot of stigma and challenges. So on the criminal justice side, I kind of had built a reputation up. The cops knew me. I was, when I was high, I was very combative, and I had, I was all like tough person, and so I would fight with the cops, and I gave myself a pretty good reputation in this community. So when I got clean, they still saw me as a junkie living on the streets, right? I still carry that stigma today, and I've been in recovery for quite a while. I run into some officers and they still look at me like I'm a street level junkie. They don't care how much, how much I've grown and that I'm not like that anymore, but a lot of police officers, they don't want to let that go. They still see me as a criminal. So that was really difficult for me. So when you get clean, you want to get services, right? So I'm a co-occurring person. Co-occurring means that I have a mental illness, plus I'm an addict. When I would go to a service provider, food stamps, anything, I would be looked down upon. Now, when you first get clean, when you first get off the streets, it's really hard to make it to appointments. It's really hard to wrap your head around anything at all. And I had no help. I was looked down upon. I would show up 10 minutes late for an appointment, and they would tell me that I could never be seen again. Like I'm never gonna get food stamps because I'm clean. I went to the OPA office and I was like, I'm clean, don't you understand? I need help, I'm clean. And I'm struggling, but I got no help. Now this was, when I first entered into recovery was in 2005. There's been a lot of change since then, excuse me. So I felt like when you're sitting across the desk from a service provider who doesn't understand addiction and they tell you, just stop using. Just stop using. What's wrong with you? Why can't you stop using? Well, I couldn't stop using because I'm an addict. Like, that's where I found my relief, and that was my go-to coping skill for a long time until it controlled me. When I was able to bank some clean time, went back to the university, which I had been kicked out of for starting a meth lab with their equipment. That didn't go over very well. But I got back into school and I graduated. But my daughter, who was the victim of my drug use, my daughters, she chose the streets at a very young age. So she was, I was clean, but she was not. And I was trying to repair the relationship as a mom, and she wasn't a willing participant at all. So she ended up in youth court. Now youth court they looked into me and they all knew what I was like and who I was. So I had to fight the stigma as a mom, a clean mom in recovery who was trying to help her daughter, and they criticized me. I felt like I was being victimized by the courts for them. My daughter ended up getting taken away and being put in a youth place over in Sheridan, Wyoming, which was really not cool for our relationship. She's 10 hours away from me. I wasn't allowed to go see her. So that tore me up, and I didn't have any, I'm a big 12-stepper, but I didn't find a lot of support to support me in what I was going through. I ended up going back out. I went back to my old coping skills. So when I came out the second time, I wanted it to be different. Now I had all of this experience. I knew what I was facing. When I first got out of, I went to jail in Idaho. When I first got back and returned to Missoula, I was finding it really hard to stay clean. I couldn't do it. I knew what I needed to do, but I was so beat down that I had a hard time doing it. Now she said, like she was talking about when you stop, third offense, 30 days in jail. I was banking on that. So I went to Rosar's and I stole a bottle of Worcestershire sauce because I thought they're gonna put me in jail for 30 days and I can get clean. Like that was my thinking. Well, they didn't put me in jail. they put me in treatment court, which was great. You know, treatment court is exactly what I needed. They gave me the support, and coming back, I wanted to do it differently. I didn't want to repeat the same mistakes that I had made in the first time of me trying to get clean, because I didn't want to go back out again. Like, it's not cool out there. It's hard. But you know, when you're living on the streets, when you feel like you're being targeted by every person that's there to help you, it's easier to be incarcerated. It really is. You know, we get used to it. We're safe. We don't have to worry about shopping. We don't have to worry about where we're going to sleep. We don't have to worry about any of it. We're taken care of in there. So now I'm a peer supporter. So my journey has led me to help other people. There's something very profound about one addict helping another. Like, if you haven't been an addict, if you haven't experienced a street level junkiness, you're not ever going to understand my story or my plight, right? See, I'm all shaky.
You do good.
So the people that I work with, we get to build a connection on mutuality, on shared lived experiences. That has changed everything for me and for my peers. Peer support wasn't offered when I was trying to get clean. Boy, it would have made a big difference. I'm really fortunate that I get to do the work that I do today. I get to be a voice for people who don't have the voice. I was always the yes girl. I agreed with everything you had to say. I had no opinion of my own because I had no confidence in myself, no faith in myself. I had lost all of it. So now I get to go and I get to speak. I get to push for things that I believe in. I get to be that supportive person who understands and gives somebody hope, help them find hope again. It's very wonderful. And the part of the restorative justice, you know, my victim was this community. I had to pay back to this community, and I feel like that's what I'm doing today. I get to give back to my community in a healthy way, but I still fight stigma every single day. When I tell people that I'm a recovering junkie, they look at me like I'm a recovering junkie. You know, to me, that's not a bad thing. I'm used to saying it. You know, that's my reality. I don't practice it anymore, but that is my history. So I still have to fight that stigma, and my peers, they have to fight it too. You know, when we're co-occurring, we're double, you know, we went to drugs to medicate. Like, we found comfort in drugs because then we didn't have to feel what we were feeling. We didn't have to think. We didn't have to think about our horrible past or what we were doing to our children or what we were doing to our parents. Because we toned out, right? We just clicked off the light and we were done.
Lori,
So-
could you talk just a little bit about the impact of having to check that box, felon, when you go to rent an
Yeah.
apartment, or we're talking about help for student loans or any federal benefits, all that?
Yeah. I hate that box. I hate that box because they don't even give you a chance to explain your situation or that you're a great person, right? We're all great people. We all deserve a chance. When I got out, when I came back the second time, I was a landscaper first time, so that was a little bit of a different experience. I think construction's a little bit more lenient on the felony box. But I didn't want to do that anymore. I'm not a 22-year-old man. I used to be, but not anymore. So when I got out, for one, I was beat down. It's hard to sell yourself when you're beat down to a landlord, to an employer, or anything. And I wanted to be, I'm a good worker. I was born to work. I was a good employee. My parents were small business owners. But they didn't care. I signed up for Jobs. Jobs is a jobs opportunity-based services, and they help people find jobs. I went to hundreds and hundreds of applications, and nobody would hire me. They would interview me, and they would tell me, do you have anything else, you know, what about this felony here? And I'm like, yeah, I have one. we can't hire you. But you just said you loved me and I would be perfect. But now I'm not because I'm a felon. I was fortunate that the people at jobs saw me working hard. They gave me a job, which gave me confidence. But I was still homeless. I was homeless for a long time when I got clean. Because finding housing is harder than finding a job. I couldn't really get well until I had a secure roof over my head. My first 7 months in recovery, I lived in a storage shed. A storage shed with a bunch of stuff in there. I had a little corner with my bed, and I loved it. It was so much better than what I came from. I knew where I was gonna sleep every night. I knew where my cat was. You know, I was safe, and it helped me. It gave me my confidence back, gave me my hope back. Now I'm a peer supporter, and I just bought a trailer. So now I don't have to rent anymore and go through all that. But that's what I had to do. You know, even with the years of experience and the years of clean time that I have, I'm a felon. I'm a 2-time felon. There wasn't a landlord out there that was gonna touch me. So I bought my place. Yeah, so.
Ann, do you want to talk to us a little bit about holistic tribal defense? It seems like that is some great examples of restorative justice and what you are doing.
Yeah, thank you. Lauren, thanks for telling your story, but I think you just told my clients' stories. So thank you, and it reminds me of how I need to continue to tell my clients' stories, no matter how much a judge doesn't want to hear it, prosecutor doesn't want to hear it. We got to keep telling the stories. So thank you. There's just so many things I was thinking of when you were talking, but just today I wrote a letter to a potential employer because my client called and said, I had a misdemeanor in 1997 that's coming up in my criminal history. I've applied for a job, and they've screened me out for this misdemeanor from 1997. And she doesn't have the opportunity to have that expunged. So I wrote a letter to the potential employer saying, there are some new trends now for employment. And one is that you don't screen out immediately. If this person becomes a finalist, then you may talk to them about the conviction, the misdemeanor from 1997, ask them what the circumstances were and what kind of rehabilitative efforts you made, and then decide whether there's somebody that you might want to hire. So it's not just felons that deal with that. So in 2009, the Tribal Defender's Office, Public Defender's Office for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes looked at the rate of our clients who were recidivating, reoffending, cycling through the criminal justice system, basically on misdemeanors. But what was happening to our clients was that they were spinning off into the state system and ending up in prison. And when I was telling you the statistics for the overrepresentation of natives in the Montana prison system, the largest number of those people were coming from the Flathead Reservation. So, and partly that's because of the concurrent jurisdiction with the state. So what we were observing is that many of our people were struggling with co-occurring issues, mental illness and addiction. So we applied for a federal grant to implement an in-house mental health program. That was really money mostly targeted for mental health courts. At that time, my opinion was that I wanted to have an in-house program that was client-centered, because what we were seeing was our clients being jammed into programs whether it fit or not. And so what was happening was our clients were expected to meet the needs of the program, not the program meeting the needs of the client, and so it just wasn't working. So with that, we were able to have psychologists in our office, and a case manager. As what happens with federal funding, we lost that funding 2 years later, but at that time, we adopted a model of holistic public defense. We didn't get funding to do that, but we received technical assistance from the Bronx Defenders in New York, who developed the model of holistic defense. Holistic defense is a method of providing public defender services that address the issues that bring our clients into the criminal justice system, and also all of those collateral consequences that come along with not only convictions but charges. And what I mean by that, for my clients, if my clients are charged with a crime, that often means they are in jail, pre-trial, before they've been convicted of anything. Because I have clients who can't post $100 bonds. So what happens to them is, if they have a job, they're going to lose that job because they're sitting in jail. If they have children, they're going to have child protection involvement because of the charge. If they are in public housing, they're going to lose that housing because of a charge. And by the way, that extends to members of the household. So in a tribal community, that can mean grandma, who is the head of household in the public housing, has grandson who's in a car that gets pulled over and they find a marijuana pipe on grandson, grandma gets evicted. So these are the kinds of things that happen. So the model of holistic defense, which is a model that can be adapted to really any public defender program, but really fits very well in a tribal community when you're supposed to be looking at the person as a whole and looking at the person in the context of their community. So there are 4 basic principles to holistic defense. One is seamless access to services for our clients. And Lauren talked about how difficult it was to access those services. What we find is that there are so many barriers thrown up for our clients when they're trying to access services. Transportation, the rules of the service program. If you fail to make it to 1 or 2 appointments, you're kicked out of the program. Then where are you? That's why we wanted to have services in-house as much as we could. Another aspect of holistic defense is an interdisciplinary team with a dynamic interdisciplinary communication. So we're not a public defender's office that has a social worker and we just make a referral to the social worker and forget about it. We're working together, providing services to the client. The client's at the center, and we are constantly communicating with each other to provide services. Now, when we started that, we didn't have those specialties. We did have our psychologists. We retained that through some funding donated by Tribal Health. But what we had was just a core team of people that developed their own specialties. So we have our criminal advocate at the time, who was very connected culturally to her community, started a cultural mentoring program that we have now, which is volunteers in the community who will mentor our clients to reconnect to their tribal community. We also, through that program, were able to get regular meetings with our 2 culture committees on the Flathead Reservation, who are our tribal elders, to ensure that we're doing what is culturally appropriate to try to help our clients reconnect to the community. They also, our clients, had the opportunity to meet with these elders, which, by the way, immediately they feel that connection. Who are you? Who do you belong to? I know your grandmother, that kind of thing. And it's just a wonderful process to be exposed to. We have advocates with interdisciplinary skill set. Now, of course, the Bronx Defenders has, on one team, they may have criminal defense, civil lawyer, dealing with all those civil collateral consequences, immigration lawyer, investigator, advocates who deal with the public assistance programs, any number of people. They're a huge program that is funded. We are a small program that is not funded. And so we just formed one team to try to address all the issues bringing our clients into the system. Finally, and really one of the most important things, especially in our practice, is a robust understanding of and connection to the community we serve. And so what we wanted to do was be present in our community and hold ourselves out as a community clinic. So we're just in the tribal complex on Highway 93 in the Flathead Reservation. We're not in the neighborhood in the Bronx. But our open door policy is a way that we've established ourselves as a community clinic. So people know they can come to our office. If they have a question, we will answer the question and not say, we don't do that, go somewhere else. We have people that haven't eaten for 3 days, so we have food in our office and offer them something to eat. They need to use the phone. They are welcome in our office, and we are getting feedback from our clients now telling us, especially our re-entering clients, telling us that makes all the difference. When they come back, if I have a client that's been gone for a couple years in prison and comes back, I am so happy to see them and see them sober and really being resilient, because that is the thing that I take away from my clients. They are resilient, and it's an honor to know my clients. So as a result of all that, we offer the cultural mentoring program. We have a pro se clinic, which was a storage closet that we just put a couple computers in and developed some standardized forms so our clients who have to represent themselves in tribal court are able to draft forms and get assistance from our civil advocate on how to do that, how to represent themselves in tribal court. We have a driver's license restoration program. It's one person who calls DMV for the person and says, why is their license suspended? And they walk them through that whole process and how to get the license restored. And we've been really pretty successful with that. Just that little bit of help. If I've got my numbers right, since 2011, since we started doing that, I think 160 of our clients have gotten their licenses restored. Many of whom never had a license, no, they have a driver's license. I was thinking that we should start putting pictures, driver's license pictures on the wall and have it be our Hall of Fame. But we do that too. We have, many of our clients are really gifted artists, and so we're encouraging them to put their artwork on our walls and have credit for their artwork. We have an in-house psychologist still. We do a community service program, which means once a year, we'll ask the court to do basically a fines amnesty day. If you show up, it's actually a warrants amnesty day. If you show up that day on a warrant for fines, you can walk out of the courtroom, and then the next day you can come and work with the tribal defenders at Blue Bay, which is a campground owned by the tribes, and we do a cleanup day. The first year, the word got out on Facebook that it was a trap. The tribal defenders are just trying to get you trapped and go to jail. The second year, the court says it not put a post on Facebook that said it's not a trap. So it's going to take a few years before that actually takes and people really believe it. We do community education and outreach in our community, not only to educate our clients regarding issues that are relevant to them, like how do you get into college, how do you get a job, but also those issues that affect our clients. The next one that I'm planning is to do a community education about the bail system and how people are held pre-trial. And the primary reason my clients plead guilty is not to really control the sentencing, but to get out of jail. They're just going to plead out to get out of jail because they can't afford to stay in jail pre-trial. So the last thing we were able to do as part of our holistic defense program is a reentry program. Once again, we didn't want to have reentry as a supervision program, as a program run by the prosecution or the court. We wanted it to be supportive services provided by our office. So we were able, once again, to get federal funding to do that. Once again, we've lost that federal funding. Just found out we lost the federal funding. But what we were able to do is incorporate our already existing holistic defense program, add a case manager who helps people with all those issues when you get out. Trying to find a job, trying to find housing, #1 problem. I don't know how many times I drive my clients to the Poverello from the reservation so they have a place to sleep. In the summer, we keep tents in our office and lend them out to our clients so they have a place to sleep. The big thing that happened with our reentry program is we had 2 psychologists at the time who were both doing their dissertation on our reentry program. As a result of that, they have developed what we call the reentry intake and assessment tool, which is a tool that not only incorporates what the client's needs are, it's a self-driven tool. So in other words, the client tells us what their primary needs are upon reentry. And by the way, we're saying reentry is anything from getting out of tribal jail after spending a couple days there to getting out of Montana State Prison. So the client drives what the primary needs are, but also what they've incorporated into the REOT tool is a risk assessment tool that's specific to Native people. There is no such tool, by the way, that we're aware of. So specific to Native people in our community, it's not going to translate across the board, but once they have validated that tool with their data, we believe that other Native communities can use that, and actually had a conversation with somebody at the Department of Corrections whether they may want to use that with their Native population. So that's going to be a valuable tool that we can use regardless of the funding, because we have these 2 PhD students who are doing their dissertations on that. So that's how we're trying to address the issues that bring our clients into the criminal justice system and all those collateral consequences that just go on forever, especially if you're poor and going through the criminal justice system. And if you know of any funding, please let me know. We're looking.
We didn't get to all of our heavy-duty questions. We got to a lot of great ones, but I wanted to give some time if folks have some questions. We have about 10 minutes, and you're welcome to ask some questions.
Can you just say it really loud?
Yeah, something rather ironic or struck me, that on the one hand, upon conviction or plea, there may be direction to rehabilitation and remediation of the emotional, rational, addictive component of the defendant. But then I said, well, how serious does that have to be in order to be a defense to the underlying crime?
Pretty difficult.
Yeah, real difficult. I'm gonna stand up because my butt's getting tired. Yeah, the criminal justice system allows for a mental disease or defect defense, okay, which doesn't include at all use or addiction to drugs. Like if you commit a crime under the influence of a drug or any drug, alcohol's a drug, we have a statute that specifically says that's not a defense. There was a case, Egelhoff, that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it went to the Supreme Court because at the state Supreme Court level, a guy was so drunk he blacked out. Next morning, he and his friend were out camping near Libby. His friend's dead, and he was charged with the crime, and he was convicted. He said, "How could I form the requisite mental state to kill my friend if I blacked out? If I was blacked out?" The Montana Supreme Court agreed with that, and the U.S. Supreme Court overturned it, and then the legislature responded with a statute. So you can't, if you voluntarily ingest alcohol, drugs, whatever, and you commit a crime, whether you know you're doing it or not, you can be convicted and thrown in prison for that.
That's the voluntary ingestion.
Voluntary ingestion, right. Mental disease or defect is a whole nother game, and that's like if you're schizophrenic or something, they send you down to Warm Springs and they'll evaluate you for, first of all, are you competent to even stand trial? Do you even know you're in a courtroom? Do you even know what's going on? They can actually medicate you to competency, which I always found was real interesting. Yeah. So if they can get you medicated enough to understand you're in a courtroom, then they can try you and convict you and put you in prison. Okay. But the other side of it is if you do truly have a mental illness, you have to be found to have, at the time the crime was committed, to not have understood the illegality of your actions, to not have understood you were doing something wrong. You know, I've seen cases where they thought the person was, you know, had horns, devil horns coming out of his head, and the voices were telling him, you have to kill Satan. And so it has to be really, really, really bad, though, and it's a rare day that a mental disease or defense can actually be successful. And the outcome of it is that you go to Warm Springs State Hospital. If you are found guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, you go to the Warm Springs State Hospital, and then you're kept there until the judge, essentially till the judge lets you out, based upon what the psychiatrists are saying.
Thank you.
Yeah, Carla, go ahead.
Back to Michelle Alexander's book, it just seemed to me from my read through that the gist of her book is that, you know, these people, that most of the drug people in jail are in there for simple possession of small amounts of drugs. And so her view seems to me that, you know, there's no crime committed. If there's a crime, it's the crime of society against these people. And so to talk about restorative justice is to talk about what society owes the people from throwing them in a situation that creates mental illness, creates poverty, wrecks their lives, steals their lives.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment.
So if anyone would care to comment on where we go when we have such a violation of core justice, that alcohol is no crime, and a tiny bit of possession of marijuana is a 10-year in jail crime. And what do we do to pay that back to those people? Millions.
I just wanted to add something real quick. When I was arrested, I was homeless. So when I returned to the community, I was still homeless. And when you commit a crime and you're convicted, there's always fees, surcharges, restitution, all of that. I found it very odd that they didn't put me in jail for shoplifting, but they put me in jail because I couldn't pay a fine, or I couldn't pay Turning Point, the CD eval that I had to have, or I didn't, you know, they put all of these things that cost money, and I was homeless. And I couldn't get a job because I was a felon. And I couldn't get a house because I was a felon. And they expected me to do all of this money stuff. Well, that was not gonna be in my capability. So I ended up in jail a lot over that. I've been in jail, incarcerated more for not being able to pay money than any of the crimes I've ever committed. I think there's something very wrong with that.
With respect to banning the box, what's the status now of legal protection of employers for hiring felons?
I don't know if I can answer quite the legal protection for hiring felons. I know that Ban the Box has had quite a bit of movement across the nation. Partners for Reintegration was instrumental in having at least the city of Missoula remove the felony box from their hiring applications. And I think oftentimes it's the education piece behind it that talks about, you take it away as a preliminary screening, the employer still has the opportunity in a thorough background check to find out additional information, but it's that initial screening that needs to be removed, because one of the things that we'll talk about in referring back to the caste system is that, you know, we have minorities that are protected classes of people, but being a felon is not a protected class, which then allows people to prohibit or set policies, or, you know, their policies in place so that they don't have to rent to a felon, or they don't have to hire a felon. So those are some of the issues that are in place.
I wasn't thinking about discrimination by the employer against the felon, but rather the liability of the employer to third parties hiring somebody who they'll say you shouldn't have hired because he was a felon. And he was gonna do something, and he did it to me, and you're liable, you know, that sort of thing.
Well, when I talk to a lot of employers, I'd say, get a signed release of information, ask questions, and then that isn't any different from a person that you don't know. You know, just because we have a known felon, what about all those people that you hire that you have no knowledge about, as opposed to something that you can use against them? Hiring somebody just off of the streets, you have no idea who they are, maybe, just, and so, I guess, I don't know if John would like to speak more to the liability here. Nope.
I think that it needs to become more institutionalized with insurance companies and things like that, well, for instance, what Landy just said, Uber hired or let the guy drive a cab who just ran down a bunch of people in New York City. He didn't have a record. There was no black marks against him at all, and he did that. So, you know, there's no guarantees in life, and if somebody's a felon, I mean, I've heard the opposite story. People that are come out of prison and they're felons are more thankful for the job than somebody that, you know, and does a great job.
We have more to lose.
There's no movement in the legislature to enact any statutory protection for employers who...
Not that I know of, but it's a good idea,
I mean, I've
actually.
heard of this
Like
in
they,
other jurisdictions without knowing exactly what they've done about it, but this was
Yeah.
always an issue.
yeah, they passed laws to protect ski areas.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
They passed a law to protect ski areas from people suing them. If they can protect ski areas, they ought to be able to protect employers who hire felons.
Go to a baseball park.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to just touch on something, because I've been involved for several years on the government, the agency level of change, and I want people to walk away having some sense of hope, and I think that's really important. I've had the pleasure, literally, of working with every individual on this panel in different capacities. And back in 2013, I think it was the legislature that happened, well, it did happen, but the governor had what was called a reentry initiative. And then that had influence on the Department of Corrections. During that legislative session, they had House Bill, I think it was 65. Why I remember that, I don't know, but they designated a reentry task force. And that reentry task force was a lot of department heads across the state who then were educated on a lot of the different reentry issues. And I know that Ann has spoke there, and I know Janice Staten, several times. And so what that did is it gave a platform to start discussing some of the issues that were reentry and what happened with the department, what's going on with the Department of Corrections. There then became a sentencing commission, because the legislature said we need to take a look at the laws that are in place, because we are incarcerated. We're having, we're not doing things effectively. Where are we going to go? They don't want to fund the prisons, so we got to take a look at what else can happen. And then the state was, because they became a justice reinvestment state. The Council of State Governments came in. There was additional funding to come in to evaluate what was going on in our state with across the board with corrections. I'm trying to remember all of these things. And so then we had, so there's a movement. There was a movement in the Department of Corrections that was part of a reentry task force, or Office of Offender Reentry, that took a look at a strategic plan of how do we look at this. At the same time, working in the communities on reentry community coalitions. That's how Partners for Reintegration came up, and that's how we had met Ann. Ann works a remarkable program with all of the people that are working there together. We had peer support. It was a concept, I think, 4 years ago that nobody really knew much about. And I will tell you, and Lori did not give herself any credit, she went to the legislature this past session and spoke, and the legislature funded peer support. And they remember Lori every time she They do. And so I will talk a little bit about bail reform, because this last legislative session, there was one of the other House bills that came in that talked about a pretrial advisory committee. I am actually happy and honored to say that I was appointed by the Chief Justice McGrath to serve on that committee. There's 7 of us that are going to be taking a look at what pretrial reform looks like. Our last legislative session did a lot of sentence reform. I can say I wasn't happy with a lot of them, but what's going on in our state is that there's attention, and there's attention to it, there's education, there's a movement, it's being addressed. And you have to think about the 3 branches of government and where they come from and how that happens. So you have statewide things happening. You have the legislature actually listening to that as well. You have the local communities that are happening. When we talk about bail reform, it goes back to the same concept that we have too many people incarcerated, and they're not incarcerated, I can tell you, in Missoula for nonviolent misdemeanor offenses. They are felony offenses and pretrial offenses and holds. And how do we change the concept and the culture and use the data? Because we're in a system where we collect data to make those decisions. And so I can guarantee you the next legislative session is going to be focusing on felonies, and it's going to be focusing on bail reform. Mark my words. But so a lot of these things are really big or high art, and how do you get involved in those? But at the local level, because I was instrumental in talking to various communities about how you do get involved. Are you involved at a legislative level or talking to your senators and your representatives? We have some key people in our community who were instrumental in moving some of those things forward in the legislature this year. But at the same time, how do you do that one-on-one connection? There are some reentry communities that are working on dealing with one person at a time. And also focusing not only about how to get people out of the system, using diversionary efforts and getting people not into the system. And that still comes back to, and I'm going to say it over and over again, is mental health and treatment support services. And we see that being cut a lot, but how do we come back and help those people? So I'm sorry if I spoke too fast, but I knew we were out of time and I had to say that.
Thank you.
So thank you, Gretchen.
Yeah, I have hope when I see all of you folks show up on a dark and stormy night.
Absolutely. Yes, so thank you.
A couple other things that are going on, though, also when we talked about the disparity of Native people in the justice system, Missoula County is actually studying that and what some solutions can be, so that's a real positive. The University of Montana is doing a study of the overrepresentation of Native women in the women's prison, and they're actually they're doing interviews and collecting data, focusing on whether holistic defense could be a solution and housing. So there are some great things that are happening.
There's a couple questions over here.
Okay, how about we do one more question? Leon, you want to go for it?
Yeah, I've got a question. The title of this book is Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And I'm just wondering, the focus is about African Americans, and when people read this book, they take from it this about African Americans in urban centers and places like that. And my question is, and I'm new here, in a well-meaning place like Missoula, Montana, where there are no minorities, how is it that the natives are the ones that are disproportionately represented in the penal system? Was there a meeting where you decided let's target those folks as opposed to the black people that don't want none of them?
Was there a meeting what?
Was there a meeting where you decided, since the minorities here are the natives, let's target those folks? Is that right? So the state say, hey, you gotta find somebody, so these are the ones that we're gonna target?
Yeah, I don't know, I wasn't invited. I just looked at the Department of Corrections biennial report and came up with those numbers.
If you all are interested in seeing how difficult it is for returning citizens to come back into Missoula, they're having a reentry simulation on the 9th at the fairgrounds from 9 to 11. And it's going to show the struggles that we go through when we return into the community and the barriers, it's pretty interesting.
Got that on my calendar.
Yeah.
There's a flyer over here on the
Yeah,
table.
yeah.
Yes, definitely. If you're unfamiliar with Partners for Reintegration, take that away tonight, the flyer, and get more involved. It's a great way to engage these issues. So we say thank you to these panelists very much for sharing your expertise and your wisdom and your heart with us. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.